Module Data Visualization. This specific module will focus on data visualization, which is going to be 23% of the exam. We're going to focus on the main topics of dashboards, reports, visualization tools, and business requirements. Now, the lessons that encompass this module are as follows. We're going to be talking about translating business requirements. We're going to go into a whiteboard on how we can do that. We'll talk about dashboard fundamentals, go into a demonstration as well. We'll proceed and talk about data sources and attributes, charts and graphs, report types and elements, and then we'll go through a summary review and some review questions. We have a lot to cover in the module, so let's proceed on to the next lesson. Business requirements. In this lesson, let's talk about why these are important and how we can identify these as well. When it comes to business requirements, these are really reflected by the organization, typically based on a specific project or system that needs to be met. Another way to look at it is the business has specific goals that need to be reached. So generally, these goals are going to help us identify what exactly we need to look for or perform to get to a certain level. Some examples of goals or even expectations is another way to put it, is the company wants to double market share, or the company needs to hire 20 new people next quarter. Those are very simple, basic goals that we can identify. Now, there's also additional goals that we can look at that may be more abstract. Some of these could be really understanding the type of devices that are used in specific services and trying to determine what areas we want to support and maybe what we don't want to support. That might take a little bit more time to figure out. Now, goals can be functional or non-functional. So, for example, we may want to have goals that are more financial, but we also may want to have goals that are less financial and more, what would be more reputational or being first to market. Maybe another one might be just being able to provide better services, that the customer service is better, that we can get that number up for whatever reason. So these business requirements we want to identify. Now, in the next lesson, we will go through a whiteboard and I'll walk you through how we would actually determine these in more detail. So business analysis, this is a practice of identifying these requirements. Now, we also would want to assemble what is called a business requirements document. Now, a BRD is going to be specifically a document, is really the simplest way to put it, that we're going to assemble typically in Word or Google, whatever you use. And we want to ensure that we outline where we're at and where we need to go and what are the expectations of the organization. Now, business requirements are determined and assessed by various methods. Now, as a data analyst, you're going to, of course, be working typically with a lot of different stakeholders. This could be your executives, this could be the application owners, this could be customers. It all is going to depend on your organization. It could be a distribution list. So, for example, it could be just simply an email list. It could be Teams list that you use, whatever that is. It could also be the data models we use. So, for example, if we want to use data models that are going to be more descriptive or more statistical, then that's great as well. Report types. These also will certainly matter as well. So, for example, I'm going to probably use a different type of report with different details for executives than I'm going to use for the application stakeholders as an example. So your audience is going to really determine this as well. With that said, let's go ahead and proceed to the next lesson. Translate business requirements. In this lesson, Let's go to the whiteboard and discuss more about understanding business requirements and also what we need to look at to really determine the best reports to actually assemble and consider in our business requirements processes. Let's go to the whiteboard. When it comes to translating business requirements, generally the workflow we want to consider is going to be first, we want to identify the stakeholders. Who exactly is the target audience? Who is requesting the information? Who needs the reports? Who needs to have the data analyzed? So that's really the first thing we want to consider. The second thing should be really understanding objectives. What do the stakeholders really need to obtain? What is the target? What is the objective of the specific requirement to have a report? What is the data that needs to be analyzed, right? So we really want to understand what would be the objective. Is it a financial objective? Is it going to be more or less a functional or non-functional? We then want to look at the requirements. So what do we really need to have in place to be able to help meet those objectives? Do we need specific types of data? Do we need to have specific stakeholders in place? Do we need authorizations? Then what we need to also look at is the approach we're going to use to collect data, but also the data sources. For example, we may need to gather data not only from, let's say, a data source perspective, but we may need to also perform surveys. We may need to sample. So these are things we have to consider. So once we've decided the data sources, we then want to, of course, dive into those data sources and determine, are we going to really be able to meet the requirements and actually put together a report for the specific type of objectives that we have to meet. Now, as part of some of the things to consider, I've put them over here in the table. We'll likely want to consider when we're getting ready to determine the report type, what exactly would be the filtering, the sorting that needs to be done, what would be the frequency of the data. So would we be sampling daily or weekly, etc., right? Now, what about how we want to display it? Is it going to be a dashboard or is it going to be a non-dashboard, such as a report? So if it's a report that is going to be provided in, let's say, PDF, well, that's going to be different than if we had to assemble a report in a dashboard. And then again, as we had stated earlier, right, we need to have our stakeholders in place. Those stakeholders could be really just about anyone, depending on who the target is for the audience. So one thing to consider, though, is if we're trying to market towards executives, the report is going to, of course, want to highlight very specific information that is probably going to be less detailed but more objective-oriented. So, for example, what would be the target revenue? Has it been met? What is the year-over-year increase? On the other hand, if it's data owners or customers, the level of data may very well be different. So when we consider as well who the data is going to be sent to, we also may want to also have a distribution list. And that distribution list is what? It's going to be typically at least one, if not many different stakeholders that may actually need to receive that data. And lastly, one more thing to consider is the dimensions. Now, we may very well need to put together custom dimensions. We may need to also have custom measurements. So we want to also consider those factors when we're getting ready to assemble reports and dashboards and really make sure we're able to provide a very specific output that is going to be able to relay the data in a manner that the stakeholders require. So with that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Dashboard fundamentals. In this lesson, we want to understand what a dashboard is and also some of the components as well we should consider. Now, when it comes to a dashboard, it's a dynamic interface tool that is going to help us make decisions. And the way the dashboard works is that we're going to be able to go into what is really a web interface that is going to have active data sources that we could view data. Now, when it comes to dashboards, it's generally really important to consider the audience if you're designing dashboards because of many different factors. But generally, the dashboard needs to provide insight into whatever KPIs have been identified. So, for example, if your CIO is requesting a dashboard and he wants to understand what exactly is the month-over-month or year-over-year statistics for the company, revenue, whatever those numbers will be, you need to put together a dashboard that will, of course, help the stakeholder, the CIO, understand those questions and get those answers all at the same time. And generally, as part of KPIs, we need to, of course, set up dimensions to be able to do that, and we'll talk more about those in a few minutes. So the metrics are going to be generally KPIs, numbers that we want to measure. Now, this could be everything from uptime, it could be the number of users, it could be revenue, whatever those numbers identified as KPIs, these are things that we want to measure. Now, one of the really great things about a dashboard is that they're generally customizable. So what we want to do is consider the audience. Provide a dashboard that is meant for executives. Provide a dashboard for the operations team. Whatever those requirements are, be aware that the audiences may very well have different requirements and have different interests as far as what they're looking for. So having multiple dashboards can definitely help. Now, one of the things about working with organizations to establish dashboards is that there's going to be a good amount of insight that you'll probably need to listen to. What I mean by that is generally this is a development exercise that is going to require a lot of the different feedback mechanisms to be put in place. This could be everything from POCs over to just basically demonstrations or even just listening to the customer, to the stakeholder, and putting together basically a sample dashboard for them to provide feedback on. So there's a number of different things we could do here. So what about the data? Where is it going to come from? So dashboards can certainly have various data sources. Now, these data sources can come from cloud services. They can come from on-prem. They could be SaaS. Whatever that source is, we want to identify them. Now, the data could be live data or it could be static data. In reality, dashboards should be providing live data. However, again, it all depends on what are the requirements, what's available. These are things you'd want to work out. Now, generally, when we're considering the Data Plus exam, I want to point out that there's really two terms here that we want to just make sure we understand but don't confuse. So first is dimensions. This is an attribute that is going to separate data into categories or segments. So when we hear the term segment, we're really referring to, in the world of reports and even dashboards, typically a dimension. So this could be something that is really tangible, is probably the best way I could put it. So this would be like an item. This would be clothing, houseware, tools. This could be order numbers. Whatever those dimensions are, they're typically something tangible we could identify. Now, measures are a little different. This is really more of a numerical value in the sense of how many were bought. It doesn't really per se mean a specific number of items in a lot of cases. So for example, we may have 100 orders, but we may have 200 items that were sold. So measures are really identified to be explored by the user. So this is how many widgets, when the widgets are used, what time they may have been bought. Again, dimensions and measures can be sort of confusing, so we want to make sure we can grab the concept and the similarity but differences as well. Now, dashboard planning, wireframes. If we need to plan the design of a dashboard, we want to typically put together a blueprint. We also want to consider mock-ups. So this is typically what is considered very similarly, like in the world of deploying IT, would be like a proof of concept. So what we're doing is really putting together a POC to validate that the dashboard has what it needs to have for the user. Commonly, a lot of organizations may want to use solutions like Graphene, for example. Google has their own solution. So really depends. Mobile is a whole different animal. So with that said, just be aware from a high-level perspective, that's all you really need to know for the Data Plus, is what a wireframe is and what a mock-up is. Okay, so another thing, too, is we should really be aware that during development, we should also consider some of the items like releases, access roles, RBAC, that's role-based access security as well. So when it comes to drilling down, that's really where we want to dive into a specific data point around components. I'll talk more about this in the demonstration in the next lesson. So drill downs are really data points into specific components. This would be, for example, we have a virtual machine. That virtual machine may also have CPUs and memory. So those would be sort of similar to like subcomponents, is another way to look at it. Or if we look at data that we may want to put in reports, transactions. What's the transaction volume? What was the number of transactions, right? These are things that we could drill down into. Now, roll up. This is where we go from basically a submenu to the main menu is another way to look at it. So a subcomponent to the main component. So it's really the opposite of a drill down. And then another thing to consider is to have saved searches. This is really important because generally users are habit driven. They want to look at the same data over and over to compare it down the road. So having saved searches in your dashboards is very important. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Dashboard fundamentals. In this lesson, let's walk through some dashboard and report fundamentals so that we have a better idea of how things may work in a typical reporting dashboard. Let's go over to the demonstration. I'm over here at Google Cloud. There's a service called BigQuery. It is a hyperscale data warehouse and allows us to bring in terabytes or even more of data for us to run queries against. Now, we could use any number of data sources with Google Cloud BigQuery. Now, remember, data sources, they can come from, of course, various sources. It could be live data, it could be static data. But in this case here, we're going to use some static data that is from basically the BigQuery public data. Now, if you're new to data analytics, this is a great service because of several factors. One, you could use it for free up to certain limits. Two, they have the public data sets, not all of them, but a good amount of them already brought into BigQuery, so it's really simple for you to just run queries on data to get practice. Now, I've already created a specific query that I want to run. It's a very simple one. It's against the Bitcoin data. So what I want to do here is go to Save Queries. I'm going to run this query that I have put together. It's basically a select statement against the block number and the size and the timestamp, really, I want to start at. And then I have a limit of 1,000. Now, I'm going to run this query. Now, after I run the query, you'll see that it'll give me results. You can see that results per page is 50, and then there's basically 1,000 pages or so limited. So there's quite a bit of data. Now, I can go over here to charts. Now, some of the first terms I want to talk about is the x-axis and the y-axis. So we know that the x-axis is here, and then we have the y-axis. So if I go over here, I look at the block number. So the block number is on what? The y-axis. So this tells me the block number, and it also, again, will let me change this over here and change the view, for example. So I could swap, for example, the size with the row number, and you can see how that changes the output. I could also change it to a bar chart as well if I want. So there's a lot of important capacity built in already with BigQuery. Now, there's a lot of other features that are beyond the scope of the course, so I'll need to move on. What I'd like to do now is talk about dimensions and measures and dive into reports and some of that fun stuff that we'll need to know for the examination coming up if you take it. Okay, so I go over here to Explore Data, and I'm going to use Looker Studio. Now, Looker Studio is formerly known as Data Studio, for those familiar with that. So in the world of Bitcoin, this is called the block height is another way to look at it. And then we have the size as well plotted out. Now, what's nice here is I could go select this specific chart, and I could go and I could change it on the fly pretty much. And you can see that it'll change automatically. Now, remember, we want to keep in mind as well what are the dimensions, the measures we need. So from the previous lesson, we talked about dimensions. So dimensions are what? These are going to be attributes that are used to separate data into different categories. So over here, I want to separate block number from the block size. As an example, again, this is a very limited sample query I did just for ease of use and to keep in the time that I have to do it. But be aware, you can make this as powerful as you want and as complex as you want. So dimensions are what? They're attributes that we use to separate data. Now, measures. So measures are what? They're going to be used to identify like how many items or services or widgets we use, for example. So be aware of those terms. Okay. Now, I could also go in here and select different types of like maps and plots and all that fun stuff. Now, the reality is that some of this will work really well. Some of this, of course, won't work really well. Like, for example, a time map is not really meant to do the job of what a graph should do or some kind of other way to visualize, right? So a table, it might be a little bit different, right? So just be aware that you can play around with this as a really good tool to really just understand how well your data may get laid out based on the results that you have. So again, this is great from showing a percentage perspective, but again, this is a pie chart, probably not ideal for what we're doing. So if I go to a column chart, this would show, for example, the block number better and the size. So this, again, is a great way to view the size and the block number. So that visually makes sense. And of course, I could change colors if I want. I could change additional properties if I needed to. I could also add fields, on and on and on. Okay, so with that said, I could save this, and then I could also basically go over here and save it to my Google Cloud account if I want. And it is saved now to my Google Cloud account. Now, I could, of course, do a lot more with this. I could go over here and add additional types of charts and graphs and plots if I want. I could expand the number of pages. And the reason that we want to do this is when I'm completing a report, that report may have, for example, a bunch of data. So I could take these graphs, these plots, these tables, right, anything that I create, and bring them into my Word document as an example, and be able to send this off with a report. So these would be the figures I would probably want to add to a report about whatever I would be writing about. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Data sources and attributes. In this lesson, let's discuss sources and the options available as well. Now, when it comes to data sources, it's important to distinguish the difference between a source and an attribute. Very simply, a source is what? A collection of data that we're pulling into our data warehouse, data lake, whatever the service is, database, and we're going to use that for analysis. We're going to be making queries against it. Now, in that data is going to be a lot of different attributes. Now, remember, attributes are nothing more than individual pieces of data. It could be just a single row. It could be multiple rows. Whatever attributes we choose, just be aware it's the individual pieces. So, for example, customer name, phone number, etc. Now, the common data sources, as we're likely more than aware of, is going to be anything from databases and data warehouses. It could be spreadsheets, files, text documents, web services. We could use a collection of both on-prem and cloud services all at the same time. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Understanding charts and the various types of charts. In this lesson, we want to talk about the various charts and graphs available and understand how we should apply requirements to make sure we choose the right type of visualization. Now, when it comes to choosing a chart type, a lot of variables go into this. So the first thing is, when we choose a chart type, we want to understand the type of data. Is the data going to be categorical? Is it quantitative? Is it static, or is it dynamic? A number of other possible options as well. Now, what about the sources? Do we have one source only or multiple sources? We want to understand the audience. The type of data we collect will vary based on the audience, as you would expect. So stakeholders will have a different understanding of the data than someone that's a C-level executive in a lot of cases. So because of that, we need to know the audience. Now, I've done several projects where I've literally had to create 6 or 7 different types of graphs and charts and reports, for that matter, for different audiences. For example, for technical stakeholders, for executives, for semi-technical executives, or project management teams. So sometimes this is just something you'll have to get really good at trying to understand how you're going to apply what type of chart to what type of audience. Because in reality, there could be several charts and graphs, etc., that could actually work. So we want to know the purpose. So the purpose is what? What could be a purpose? Is it to show financial results? Is it to show population growth? Is it to show a historical value? Is it to show short-term value? What is the true purpose of the chart that we have to create? Now, the amount of data as well. And I would also add to that not just the amount of data, like in size, like gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, but also the amount of various types of data that we may get as well. And that sort of goes into complexity of the data, I would think, but just to point that out. So, for example, if we have data coming in from, let's say, AWS services, different services that we're running there, and on-prem, and third-party SaaS apps like software services that we would use every day, like CRM, Salesforce, then the data can get complex. So we need to think about what we could do in that scenario. I want to go through some of the more common charts available. Now, there's certainly a lot more that could be used, but I want to cover the top ones, at least the ones that I saw in the objectives and ran into on the exam. Now, I would also recommend, too, that you take a little bit of additional time before taking the exam to prepare yourself on understanding the use case for probably the top 10 graphs and charts and table styles that you could use. So the first one I talk about is a bar chart. Now, a bar chart is going to be commonly used when we want to really show from a visualization perspective how the data stacks up against, for example, other collection points of that data, or compared to other, for example, categories that we are comparing it to. So, why would we want to use a bar chart? It's used for what type of data, and I have it highlighted below there because I have found people can get confused between bar charts and histograms because in some realities they can definitely look the same. So it's really about how you apply the data and the type of data. So first, categorical data. If we have categorical data, we would want to use a bar chart. If we have, for example, the need for quantitative data, then we'd want to use what is called a histogram. Now, what exactly would be the difference between the types of data? So, for example, categories could be as simple as a state and then different cities under that state. Or, another example could be financial tools that you could use or financial instruments you could select. So how well does mutual funds perform against bonds and vice versa? Now, when it comes to pie charts, this is another very popular way to display data. This is great for summarizing a nominal set of data, basically showing different values. For example, population would be an easy one to show when it comes to a pie chart, or, for example, income levels between populations in like town. So those are really good examples of using pie charts. Now, bubble charts. Now, these are also known as plot charts as well. Now, when it comes to bubble charts, these are also really an extension of what's called a scatter plot. So this isn't a great example I put in here because of the type of data, but again, just realize that a scatter plot is really good when you want to have relationships that are typically mapped over time over multiple numeric variations or variables. So that's why we want to use a bubble chart. And the last type of chart I want to talk about is a waterfall chart. Now, if you've ever managed projects or if you've ever had to keep track of expenses, this is something you probably have used quite a bit. Now, this is great for showing an initial value and a final value. The reason you want to use this is, again, to really be able to highlight the positive and negative values that are basically in effect, let's say, over a project. Now, when we consider, for example, the start and the finish, the goal is to have a center line, a median, to basically display like the midpoint, or a better way to show it is just have 0, then have the positive and the negative below that. The goal, again, is to really show, are we making money, are we spending more money than we did the previous month? And it really gives us that insight that we wouldn't get otherwise. And lastly, as far as this lesson, we want to be aware of the design and color that we use. We want to make sure that the cover is going to really reflect what the report is about and also catch the eye of the audience. Now, simply put, cover design is really important. The title should be very direct and clear. You don't want to have, for example, a title that's 3 sentences long. It should be no more than typically 1 line or 1.5 lines, at least from a best practice perspective. So when it comes to instructions, those instructions should be very clear. So the report should have an introduction that sort of says, here's what it's about, here's the audience, here's the goal of the report, and the expected outcome. Then we should look at the fonts as well. One of the big challenges is to really understand what is the right font to use. And I would recommend you do take a quick look at various fonts, like, for example, Arial or Serif, and really try to understand which one visually is better from like a dashboard perspective or from a report perspective. So with that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Report types and elements. In this lesson, let's talk about the various options for reports. Now, when it comes to reports, there's a number of different types of reports, and for the Data Plus certification exam, you'll want to at least be aware of these. So first, we have static and dynamic. These are reports that are going to be either static, meaning that it is a one-time report that does not update. In other words, it might have been ran a year ago, and that report doesn't change. Dynamic reports are going to be updated as needed, and so they'll change frequently. Ad hoc reports. This type of report is a report that is ran typically at a request or by a certain need. As an example, it's not scheduled, so therefore your CIO says, Joe, I need a report to highlight the financial earnings of our company to this date. That's an ad hoc report. Another way to name it is an on-demand report. Now, for the Data Plus certification prep, I want you to be aware that there's really an on-demand self-service report as well that you might run into. So this is a little bit different. Now, this is an ad hoc report, but we call it on-demand self-service in the sense that we go into a dashboard and generate the report ourselves. So if I go over to a cloud service like Salesforce and I generate a report on that, that is on-demand self-service. Now, ad hoc would be a little bit different in the sense that I can still do that, but it is a request that is sent to you from someone else that you're going to perform. Okay, so recurring reports. This is the type of report that is ran typically on a schedule. It can be daily, weekly, monthly, whatever that schedule is. Tactical reports. Now, this is a type of report that is typically ran to provide some kind of quick insight into how a problem might be solved, how to basically identify information quickly, and answer a question. Now, research is really a deeper dive and is meant to be a little bit more strategic. Now, I've generally seen tactical reports referred to as strategic or strategic referred to as research. We want to be aware for this. We want to understand that tactical is going to be a short-term report to sort of gain insight as quickly as possible to answer or address a question or an issue. Research is more or less a longer-term method that is used to gather information and provide a more concise report with a number of different variables and even different audiences as well. Now, reports can provide any number of forms of visualization, from charts to infographics to maps. Again, try to determine the right audience with the right graphics, the right type of data with the right type of visualization. When it comes to documentation elements, there's a number of different elements we would likely want to have in our report. The header, the footer. Also, one thing to be aware of for this exam, I was actually a little bit surprised to see this, but you may run into not only in practice questions, but maybe on the exam as well, around the footer and a page footer. So let me clarify these. So the footer is going to be at the end of the report. So you may have 9 pages in the report. The report footer is going to be at the end of the report. And the report header is going to be the top margin. So be aware of that. Now there's also page footers. This is going to be at the bottom margin of each page. This is where we would put, for example, the title, or we would put a copyright notice there, a date, whatever is appropriate for the report. Now, watermarks are something we would add that would be a logo or some kind of a text. This is generally going to be either going to be at the bottom of the report, or commonly, if you want to make sure that if it's made public, you don't want it to be easily copied, so you put it basically diagonal across the report. And then printing. You need to have the report run date or a refresh date added to that. Report elements. When you're preparing for the exam, you also need to make sure you understand the different elements that could be inputted into a report and why they need to be there and where they need to go. So, let's say I get a question asking me about where would I put, for example, highlights for important solutions or a conclusion. That is known as a key finding. So I want to make sure I understand what the key finding is so I can answer the question appropriately. Definitions, calculations I may want to add as well. Appendix. This is basically our references. Now appendixes are typically at the end of the report, they're at the back pages. FAQ, commonly at the end of the report as well. Generally though, we want the FAQ before the appendix, so we want to just be aware of that format as a best practice. Lastly, we want to make sure you understand the executive summary. Executive summary is really an important part of the report that provides readers what is important to the report, why they should read it, what they will get out of it as well. It should also include typically a date as well in a lot of cases. So the goal is to summarize the main ideas and provide value. Now, some reports may also call this the key findings if it's not really addressed to like an executive group, a C-level group. However, generally we want to refer to the purchasers or the potential purchasers as executives in a lot of cases. But I would also refer you to go look at what would be the best practice in your industry and your organization. With that said, the executive summary is what? It summarizes the main idea and provides value so that someone can glance at the report and say, okay, this report is going to be for me, yes or no. Do I want to read the report, yes or no? Let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. Module summary. Let's go through a short review of what we covered in the module. We talked about the importance of business requirements and how we need to be able to meet those requirements that are presented to us by the stakeholders. Now, business requirements are going to be determined and assessed by any number of approaches. It could be just the expectations of the stakeholder. It could be the audience on a distribution list. It could be the data models or report types that are used. Whatever that specific requirement that's been set is, we'll need to meet those requirements of the stakeholders. Remember, it's all about providing value. A dashboard is what? It's a dynamic interface tool that allows the customer, the stakeholders, to actually dive into the data that's at hand. So the dashboard provides insight into what's called KPIs. These are also known as metrics. For example, KPI could be the revenue for that month. It could also be the number of users. It could also be the volume or churn rate of, let's say, a sales cycle that is currently happening in that organization. Whatever that dashboard is presenting for KPIs, we want to be aware that the KPIs are what really the stakeholders are looking at. Dimensions. Now, these are attributes that are specified to separate data into different categories, or also known as segments. Now, the measures are used basically by the stakeholders to explore the data. For example, what is the churn rate? What is the revenue target? What is the revenue miss? Whatever that KPI is that's used, those are considered measures in a lot of scenarios, especially if it's a revenue-based organization. So a data source. This is a collection of data that's used for analysis. Now, attributes are the individual pieces of data stored in a data source. Now, I highlighted those both for a reason, because these can be confusing. Be aware that the data source and attributes really work together to really provide us what's needed for analysis. So when we go into the exam, please make sure that you understand the data source is a collection of data, whereas the attributes are the little pieces of data that are going to be stored into that data source. So again, we have a source. It could be on a file share. It could be in a database, wherever it is. The attributes are actually what's being used in most cases on that share. Again, fairly straightforward, but from a presentation perspective, it can be confusing if you read some of the questions wrong. Okay, so choose the right type of graph for your use case. So use a bar graph if that's what you need. If you need, for example, instead of a graph, a table, use that instead. A histogram is a graphical representation of what? Quantitative data. Remember, quantitative is numbers, qualitative data is not numbers. Consider as well our elements, design, and colors when we're putting together reports. Also be aware there's a number of different report types. Select the one that is appropriate for our stakeholders. And lastly, the executive summary. Now, perhaps the most important part of the report, at least from a stakeholder perspective, to gather is a report going to provide value or not. This is what we want to be aware of when it comes to making sure that the executive summary is going to address the immediate questions that the stakeholder may have. Does it meet their requirements? Is it going to provide value to them? With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Module review questions. Let's go ahead and test our knowledge. We learned about reports. So what kind of report does not update automatically? That would be a static report. You have created an on-demand report for the executives of your company. The report is about how the company is making wise financial choices in green energy and its effects on the community it serves. Where would you want to place the executive summary in the report? Well, generally with the executive summary, it needs to be where? Pretty much in the front of the report. In other words, when someone is opening the report, it's going to be one of the first things that they're going to see pretty much right after the table of contents in a lot of cases. So, next question. Your CEO has requested a report that has never been published before and was not scheduled. What type of report would you call this? This would be an ad hoc report. In other words, it is an on-demand report, never been ran before, and it was just to meet the requirements of a specific point in time in a lot of cases. Next question. You have been requested to prepare a dashboard for a college that you work at. And this is by the attendance director. I don't know if there's an attendance director, I just made it up. So, the dashboard must contain an approach to design or designate a more meaningful name for the fields in the dashboard by highlighting attendance and the values that are affiliated with specific students, or with all students. What will we call the approach needed to be added in this scenario? Well, this is really where we need to think about captioning. So anytime we see highlights or we see, for example, meaningful, that could be a way for us to think that we need to have some text a little bit more noticeable. That's generally considered captioning. You received a report from a coworker who is going to be creating reports. Your coworker forgot to add page numbers. What do you tell her on how she should add these page numbers? Well, again, remember, this type of question seems really simple. However, be aware that as you see, if you don't distinguish between the header, the footer, report, or page footer, it can be a little confusing. Now, the page footer is actually going to be for the page number. Now, the report footer is not where we want to put the page numbers. It's more or less going to be for what? It's going to be for the report name or any kind of copyright, etc. So, with that said, let's move on to the next module.